Well, welcome everyone. Really glad to be back here with this opportunity to teach. This is the Life in the 39th Day series, where we're going through the 10 Commandments. If you missed last week, the title of the series comes from Exodus, and the context behind it is at some point Moses was invited to go up to the mountain to convene with God, to spend time with him, and to receive the law that was going to be given to this new nation of Israel. And at some point during his time up there, the Israelites started to grow somewhat concerned. They're like, where is Moses? Like, he's abandoned us. He brought us out of Egypt, and now we're stuck here in the wilderness. What are we going to do? And it was on the 39th day that trouble started to arise within the camp. Moses arrived on the 40th day, and he came to a scene of just rampant idolatry. Many of you will know the story of the golden calf, which the people requested of Aaron to be made. And it absolutely just horrified not only Moses, but obviously Yahweh, God. And so we're going through, last week, my dad gave an introduction to, see, slide 2, there we go, to you shall have no other gods but me. And for this week, we should be looking at you shall not make for yourself any idol, nor bow down to it or worship it. So really, a good way to understand these first two commandments is that they're focusing centrally on worship. It's about, first, it's right belief, which is the first one. You should have no other gods before me. And the second one is about right worship. So if you get the first one down, the right belief, there is no other God but Yahweh. The next thing that follows is, well, how do we worship in the right, correct way? Well, you do not make any of the idols. You do not bow down to anything else. You just wholly give yourself to God, to Yahweh, heart, mind, and spirit. And so the definition which my dad gave last week is, technically, idolatry is any substitution for God is a form of idolatry. Israel was continually substituting other things in place of God. And so what I'm going to add to that is the issue of idolatry is centered on faith and trust. Who do you put your faith in, and whom do you trust? The fidelity, the faith which God required of Israel was paramount. It was, I'm bringing you out of Egypt. You see the signs that I'm doing. Now come to me, put your faith in me, trust in me, and don't put it in anything else. So now here we are on the 39th day, and they're only 39 days in from Moses being removed from their camp, and their faith is now being questioned. They're like, where is God? Where is Moses? Where is our leader? He's abandoned us. What are we going to do? So quickly after being taken out of Egypt, coming through the Red Sea, seeing all of these signs and wonders, 39 days later, their faith is now being put into question. They're wondering, who should we trust? And so what they end up doing is they end up cultivating this golden calf. And so I want to just quickly actually start with Paul. This is kind of an open exhortation for us all. And so I'm actually going to begin here with Paul, and then I'm going to end with Paul, and we're going to make kind of a movement towards him. And so he says this to the church in Corinth. He says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. He's recounting the Exodus story. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and they were struck down in the wilderness. Now these things occurred as examples for us, so that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not become idolaters, as some of them did. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and the 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. And do not complain, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. These things happened to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us, the same is true for us today, on whom the ends of all ages have come. So if you think that you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide a way out so that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my friends, flee from the worship of idols. So it's very interesting that even several centuries after this initial idolatry that the Israelites committed, Paul is still just exhorting this new Christian community to not fall into the practice of idolatry. And again, one of the key things that we're going to be looking at here is idolatry doesn't necessarily mean that you have these little statues. It doesn't mean that you have a shrine or a temple somewhere in your home, or you're going somewhere else into a place of worship. Idolatry in this sense properly actually means idolatry of the heart. It's actually more of a heart issue. And so that's what Paul is really getting at in Corinthians. And what I want to do right now is kind of show you just the lineage of Israel's engagement with idolatry from this moment with the golden calf through their history up to the time of Paul. And so the primary scripture verses that we've been using has been Exodus 20. But I also want to include Deuteronomy 4 for us, because I think it actually expands on a lot of what this early nation, the nation of Israel, was going through, and what their leaders, Moses and Joshua, were really focusing on. So in the Exodus passage, what we see is, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on earth below, or in the waters below." Now, interestingly, and Deuteronomy was most likely written a little bit later, they've added some more information to this law for the Israelites to know. It's not just don't make anything in the form of heaven, or in heaven above, or on earth below, but rather, I believe it starts in verse 16, do not become corrupt and make for yourself an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, like an animal on earth, or a bird that flies in the air, or like any creature that moves on the ground, or any fish in the waters below. And when you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed to bowing down to them and worshiping things the Lord your God has appointed for all nations. Now, what's really interesting about this Deuteronomy passage, if you read it starting in verse 16, it starts with, don't make any image in a man or a woman. Then it goes to an animal, birds of the air, the fish, the sky. It's a reversal of the Genesis creation account. So if you go back from day 6, where God made humanity, and then the animals, and then the fishes and the birds, and then the stars, and then the sun and the moon, Moses here knows the people that he is talking to. He knows that they would be familiar with this creation account here. He's saying, don't make anything that God has created into an idol. Don't worship creation, worship the creator. And so he really wants to double down on this idea that these things that you see in creation, don't go out and worship them. Don't make them idols, but continue to look to your creator. And so what we will soon find out is the Israelites, as they were moving away from Egypt in the wilderness in towards the promised land, they were engaging new nations, new tribes, new people groups who were worshiping things of creation. They would worship the sun, they would worship the moon, they would worship particular gods that were related to the storms, the sea, the ground, grain, prosperity, fertility. And so the Israelites are coming into contact with all these different shapes and forms, and they're like, wait, is there more than one God? Is there someone else than Yahweh that we should be looking to? All these other nations are doing it. So again, this issue of faith and trust is being raised within this community. And I appreciate just the Deuteronomy text, because I see just Moses like expanding what he did in Exodus. He's like, no, okay. I said no image of anything in heaven or here and below on earth, but actually let's make it a bit more detailed. None of that. You just do not worship creation. You keep your eyes on the creator. And so one distinction, and this is in the Exodus passage that we were just looking at, is that there has to be a distinction between jealousy and envy. And so in the Exodus passage, it talks about just the jealousy of God, the jealousy that God has for his people. And I think we raised this question actually last week during our time of discussion on the often negative connotation of jealousy. Like when we hear of a jealous God, it might unsettle us, like, oh, jealousy, that's kind of a negative connotation for God. But I think if we look a little bit closely, jealousy is actually a positive attribute of God. And a better way to understand it is a zealousness that God has for his people. And we have to understand that God specifically chose the nation of Israel. He chose them to be his people. He had a plan for them. And later on in Deuteronomy, he makes it very clear that I didn't pick you because you were more in number. I didn't pick you because you were the greatest empire or you were the best people group, you were the most advanced. I picked you because I loved you. Like you were my people and I have made a covenant with you. Um, and that passion for his people it leads to this jealousy that he has of him. He wants and desires his people just to be with him, to stay faithful to him, to trust him. And so in the Ten Commandments, we see that God is pressing in on just this jealousy that he has for his people, just to be in communion with them. And contrast to that is the idolatry that is potential for them to fall into, something that is away from them. And so I put this right here at the bottom, that there's a good distinction between someone having jealousy and someone having envy. And so jealousy and zeal, I believe, is when you are looking and going after someone who you feel belongs to you. Like there's a connection between you. There's a relationship. You're like, yeah, I desire to be with that person because they are mine. Well, envy kind of comes from the other side and says, I like what they have. I want to take some of that. Do you see the difference? There's a slight difference there between a jealousy that God would have for his people that belong to him, that he's come into covenant with, and then not an envious God. Now, it's interesting. The people of Israel were not jealous for Yahweh, but they were envious of the other gods and the other nations. And that's that heart issue that I keep talking about. And it's very pertinent to today and what we deal with. If we look at the idols that may be in our lives, in our culture, a lot of it could probably go back down just to that basic distinction of jealousy for God, wanting that zealous relationship with him, and envy for the things that culture presents before us. You know, maybe a different way of living, better health, better relationships, a better job, better status. And you see other people, oh my gosh, especially on social media. Are you kidding me? Instagram is just a factory of idols. I mean, every day you're scrolling through it and you're seeing like different lifestyles and you get envious. You're like, wow, look at the life that they have. I kind of wish I had that. So am I now putting my faith in their lifestyle and their culture and their way of being, but not in trusting that God will actually give me all the things that I need to get through in this life? So that's, again, it goes right the way back to Israel at the very beginning. So there's some key incidents of idolatry. So a lot of people think that the idolatry proper really took place once they got into the promised land. There's probably two cases overall that really took place prior to the Israelites going into the promised land that stand out. The first was the golden calf in Exodus 32, when Moses came back down, and you see the image there. I believe that's Aaron there with his priestly vestments, and he's kind of sanctioned the building of this golden calf. And the people of Israel wanted to put their faith and their trust in that calf. And I'll talk a little bit later about the imaging of the calf. And then the second incident was a pretty horrific incident in Numbers 25, and it's the Baal of Peor. And in that instance, the Israelites, so if you look at chapters 22 to 24, I believe, in Numbers, there's an incident with a prophet who is asked by a neighboring king to go and curse the people of Israel. The king is getting kind of worried that the people of Israel are growing, they're becoming numerous, they may start invading. And so he asked this prophet called Balaam to go out and curse the people of Israel. Now, interestingly, it's really funny. Balaam goes out to curse them, but instead he can't. He can only bless them because God doesn't sanction it. And so he goes out to curse them and he keeps blessing them. And so this king is just like, what are you doing? Stop blessing them. Like, I'm asking you to curse them. I want to get rid of these people. Get them out of here. And this prophet, Balaam, all he can do is just bless the nation of Israel. So interestingly, after that, since he can't curse them through this false prophet, what happens is that the Israelites instead start intermarrying and beginning relationships with the Moabite women who are nearby. So it wasn't from the attempted curses that Israel fell into idolatry. It was the allure of the other Moabite women and their practices and their rituals that actually brought idolatry into the camp. And so this is another case where God would just burn with anger. He's like, what are you doing? I have a plan for you. I have this path into the promised land. Keep turning to me. Put your faith and trust in me. And what did the Israelites do? They turned to the Moabite women, invite them into the camp, and 24,000 Israelites died on that day as a result of it, because of their idolatry and because of their heresy. 24,000. And so, again, this is two instances very early on where the Israelites they had this heart issue. They could not give all of their heart to God. They couldn't give all of their faith and all of their trust to him. So this is just a depiction of them bowing down to different idols. There's different practices now coming into the camp. And you can just imagine how horrifying this was for Moses again. He's just like, what are you doing? You just don't get it. Keep your eyes on Yahweh. So again, actually, I mean, the Baal of Peor is just a significant event. You see it later on in scripture. It's referenced again in Deuteronomy. He says, have you seen for yourselves what the Lord did in regard to the Baal of Peor? That's when he killed 23,000 Israelites. In Joshua, again, after Moses has died, he tells them, have we not had enough of the sin at Peor, for which even yet we have not been cleansed? So even decades later, the community is still struggling that they even allowed themselves to enter into the idolatry that happened at Peor. And then even the prophet Hosea, he raised it up again. And he says that they consecrated themselves to a thing of shame. And became detestable like the thing that they loved. And so they fell in love with the idolatry of the Moabites. And it stuck with the community for a long time. They just, how could we have allowed ourselves to do something like that? So a little more on just the Canaanite gods and religion. So as the Israelites were planning to go into the land of Canaan, there was already an established set of religion, practices, rituals that the Canaanites had. Some of the names here are on the left. El is more of just like a typical name for God. I think even in the Jewish scriptures or in the Jewish tradition, we would say something like El Shaddai. It just means like God. But then you would say like El Hadad, which then refers to the rain or storm god. And so the Canaanites really believed that whenever it rained or there was a storm, there was a god behind that they would pray to for more rain. So again, that goes back to that Deuteronomy passage of Moses telling the people that, like, don't pray to these different little false deities behind everything in nature and in creation. There's only one God behind all of that, and it is Yahweh. Don't start divinizing all these different things in nature. Now, Baal or Baal is probably the most prominent one that you find all throughout Scripture. I think it's like 89 times in the Old Testament he's referenced. And he actually has different meanings. Baal isn't just one god, it's like many little gods. So any little god or deity could be considered like a Baal. So the Baal of Peor was just the deity of Peor, or the deity that was at Peor. And you see again all throughout Scripture just these encounters that the Israelites had with Baals. Asherah was supposedly the goddess or the wife of God, who offered prosperity and fertility. And then Dagon was the grain god. There's a grain god. When farmers wanted more prosperity and more crops, they would pray and sacrifice to the god of Dagon. So that's the religion those are the religions that the Israelites were coming into. They were coming into that land. And they were commissioned by Moses and Joshua that when they entered this land, they were to wipe out all of this idolatry. Do not give it an inch of space, because it will come back and it will corrupt you. When you go in there, you have to wipe it out, because it will corrupt your heart. So again, these are just the Old Testament references to the Canaanite gods. And again, I only just present this just to show you just throughout the Old Testament, the Israelites struggled with this. Like all through it, they kept encountering these gods and they just could not get rid of them. So in total, there appears to be about 139 clear references to the major Canaanite deities. What that tells you is the Israelites were not able to wipe them out. They were not able just to remove them from the scene. They kept falling back into these false idols. A key word here in the middle, and you'll see it a lot in the Old Testament, is the high places. So these are like the places of worship. And very often, for the Israelites, the tabernacle or the Ark of the Covenant, or eventually the temple, was the high place, the place where God dwelled. And what you see throughout Scripture is that the Israelites started to think like, well, what if we just invited one other idol into this high place? Like, it wouldn't be too bad, would it? Like, what's the worst that could happen? Yahweh's still up here. We praise him, but how about we just put this little idol right next to him? And then gradually over time, the whole place and all of these high places are just filled with like these little deities. And again, just completely defiling the holiness and the presence of God in those places. Okay, so moving just from Deuteronomy into Joshua. Joshua was the leader who took over for Moses. And right at the end, of his life and at the end of his time, he has these just repeated warnings to the Israelites. He's again, please love the Lord your God, walk in all of his ways, keep to his commandments, hold fast to him, and serve him with all of your heart and all of your soul. And then he even goes on in chapter 23, he says, so that you may not be mixed with the nations left here among you, or make mention of their names or gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow yourselves down to him. Joshua knew the tendency of his people. I think he was a leader who was very in touch with his community and his people. And he knew that they had the propensity to just slightly turn to the left, slightly turn to the right, like, oh, let me go check out this side. Let me go see what these guys are doing over there, and then bringing them in. And in verse 11, he says, be very careful to love the Lord your God. Give it all to him. And then there's an indictment here in Joshua 23, right at the end of verse 13. He says, of these idols, they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a scourge on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land that the Lord your God has given you. And I believe that is a prophetic foretelling of what will eventually happen to the people of Israel. Like Joshua knew that these idols were just a snare and a trap, because there was this spiritual sickness within the Israelite people. They could not give everything to God. So moving on from Joshua into the book of Judges. So after Joshua passes, you kind of, so the way in which I have always interpreted it is you have the heroes of like Moses and Aaron and Joshua. And then once they've passed, the people are now in the promised land, and they're kind of like, okay, so who's going to lead us? And one of the key verses that you'll always see in the book of Judges is that then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And you see that cycle repeating itself all through the book of Judges. You'll just see at the beginning of that chapter, then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So that they'll ask for a judge, that judge will come and save them. They kind of turn back to God momentarily. Then that judge dies. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And they abandoned God repeatedly. In verse 13, they abandoned the Lord and worshiped Baal and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to the plunderers who plundered them. So this repeated cycle of just turning back to God, falling into sin, calling for a judge, coming back to God, falling back into sin. It was just a repeated cycle all the way through this time in Israel's history. Okay, so on the bottom right here, you'll see Gideon's ephod. Now that's a really interesting story. Gideon is one of my favorite characters. So in Judges 6, we meet Gideon, and the angel of the Lord comes up to him and he says, "Peace be with you, mighty warrior." And Gideon is kind of from the lowest tribe. He's like the lowest member of his tribe. He's very meek. He's kind of like, no, like don't pick me. I'm really weak. And the Lord basically says, "Hey, I've chosen you. You're going to lead your people now. You're going to be the new judge." And interestingly, Gideon begins that conversation by saying, hold up a second, you're the angel of the Lord. We've heard all of these stories about, the Exodus, coming out of Egypt, all these signs and wonders. Where have you been? Like we're under oppression right now. People are dying. We got famines. Like, where have you been? And it's really interesting because the angel of the Lord turns to him and he says, and the first thing that the angel of the Lord asks Gideon to do is, well, before I send you out on your mission, can you go back to your house and tear down that idol to the other God that you've been serving? And so the audacity is that Gideon has this belief that he can point the finger of God and ask him where he's been, and yet right behind him in his own house are all these idols to other gods. And, I always find that really encouraging because, just the grace that God has for Gideon, even in that moment. He still chooses Gideon. He asks him to partner with him in this mission to save his people, despite that Gideon has been unfaithful and has idols in his house. He says, hey, I've chosen you. You're going to help lead these people. First thing, tear down those idols, please, because they're not welcome here. And please dedicate yourself back to me. So Gideon ends up going on this mission, and he ends up saving the people, who becomes a very mighty judge. But as many of the people in Israel did, it was short-lived, because Gideon's ephod was basically after he had defeated his enemies. The people said to Gideon at the bottom here in verse 23, they asked Gideon to lead for them. And he says, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Then Gideon said, hold up, let me make one request of you, just one little thing. Each of you give me an earring he has taken as booty. And what that means is that Gideon had this desire. He had this envy within him. He was like, I just want one thing, just one little thing. just pass me all your gold and I'm going to make this nice little ephod. And so an ephod was basically like a royal or priestly garment that people of status would wear. And that became his idol. And eventually it was his downfall. So even Gideon, he at the very beginning, he's told to get rid of the idols. He gets rid of it. He goes out, he saves the people. He becomes a great warrior. The people say, hey, we want to choose you. Please be our leader. He's like, no, I'm not going to do it. You have to serve the Lord. You have to serve the Lord. But just one thing, please, I want something nice to wear, and I want like this little idol around me. And so again, that's just that little bit of space that Gideon allowed for idolatry to come into his heart. So after this whole ordeal with the judges, we moved to Israel having a demand for a king. So after many violent years, the people of Israel requested of God through the prophet Samuel for a king. And now it's interesting here, if you look at 1 Samuel 8 in verses 4-5, they say to Samuel, who was appointed judge, you are old and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us. And here's the key point, like other nations. The people were dissatisfied with how their nation was being run. They were dissatisfied with the way in which God was caring for them, providing for them, allowing them just to prosper when they were faithful to him. And so they have that envy towards other nations. And they're like, hey, can we have a king like those guys? Because it seems to work out for them, like we can have like this tangible leader, someone we can actually follow, someone who we can see and hear and touch. They wanted not just a king, but they actually just wanted like a human idol. That's how I interpret that. And just a really heartbreaking passage here in the middle. 1 Samuel 8:7-8 says, and the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in all that they say for you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. And that really sums it up right there. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. And so again, Samuel comes back to him and is like, okay, God's going to give you a king. He's going to be like this. And the Israelites are like, no, we just want like a king like the other nations. That's what we want. And so even then they're just being stubborn about it. And so again, the central to this demand for a king is the issue of trust and faith. Who will the Israelites put their faith in? Who are they going to trust? Is it going to be Yahweh, or is it going to be a human, a king? And so, so the last bullet point I have here, the Israelites lacked jealousy and zealousness for Yahweh and held envy for the other nations around them. Okay. And if there ever was just a tragic figure, the story of King Saul always reminds me of like a tragedy from like Shakespeare or something, because it really does break your heart just to see his whole sort of character arc. And so in Samuel 15, he again succumbs to just this belief that he knows better than God. And he really did believe that he was obeying God, but he left just a little room for idolatry to come in, a little bit of like, you know what, I feel like I can get away with a little bit here. And so in verse 20, he says to Samuel, I have obeyed the Lord's voice. I've gone out and destroyed everybody that you asked me to. I brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But, now catch that, but from the spoil, the people took sheep and cattle, the best things devoted to destruction. And we did it with good intentions to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. So in this story, Saul believes that he has followed like totally the command of God to go out and wipe his opponents. But the command was to absolutely destroy them, to not take anything, do not bring anything back. Saul believed that he knew better, that he could take a little bit here and there and that it wouldn't be a big deal. And then he tried to cover himself by saying, oh, I only got it just for the Lord so I can sacrifice to him. And that just didn't go down well. Samuel says, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obedience to the voice of the Lord? Surely to obey is better than sacrifice. Again, that's just an underlying principle that you'll see throughout Scripture. It is better to obey the Lord than just offer just these superficial sacrifices to him. The Lord is not looking for superficial sacrifices to false idols or to anything. He's looking for obedience and faithfulness to him. He wants your heart. He wants you to be directed towards him, to move and breathe towards him and him alone. So again, it's an interesting point here in verse 23. For the rebellion is no less a sin than divination. That's very key. So Saul's disobedience was on the level of doing divination, of turning to another god. Saul really thought he was doing the right thing. He thought he was doing the right thing for the Lord and doing, great and wonderful things, but he wasn't. His sin was like divination, and even more, and this is probably a point for our current times, the stubbornness that Saul was showing is like iniquity and idolatry. So Samuel makes it clear that even just stubbornness, the denial that you're doing anything wrong, the belief that, no, I'm not doing anything wrong. Like, I was doing it for the Lord. You can't tell me otherwise. And I don't know if maybe you've had a friend that you've seen them kind of dabbing in sin a little bit, and you're trying to tell them like, hey, you might want to be careful of that. And like, no, I'm fine. I got this. Like, stop worrying about me. Like, worry about your own thing. And they're just stubborn to the advice that you're trying to give them, that the path they're going is leading to further sin and destruction, but they're just stubborn about it. Samuel says that that's like idolatry, just a refusal just to accept the help and the faith and the trust of the Lord. Solomon sins times 1,000. The 1,000 is for the 1,000, 700 wives, 300 concubines. But again, so when Solomon was really young, he was great in his wisdom. He was very righteous. He followed in the footsteps of his father David. And just a quick point, the reason why I skipped David is I feel like a lot more of the rest of the series will deal with David, specifically the issues of adultery and murder. So I've kind of bracketed him out a bit and kind of gone up straight here to Solomon. And so in 1 Kings 3, it says, and Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. So when he was young, he was wholeheartedly giving his life to the Lord, just like his father did. And yet you look several chapters later, for it came to pass when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as it was with his father David. So you can see just over the time, Solomon opened himself up to just the customs, the religions, the rituals, and the idolatry of all these wives that he had. He became seduced not just by the women, but also by their beliefs, their practices, and values. And that ended up just corrupting just his kingdom. It eventually led to a split within the kingdom. That's where we get the divided kingdom. You have now, after Solomon, you have the kingdom of Judah, and then the kingdom of Israel, and then just this list of different kings. And so I actually never knew this, but Solomon actively promoted the worship, not just of several idols and the sins associated with them, but he also encouraged human sacrifice. I didn't know that until reading up on it. And so again, because of his backsliding, the kingdom was divided. So again, even someone as great as Solomon, someone who has authorship of several books in our Bible, of scripture, even he fell into just a deep sense of idolatry. So this is a cool little chart. I'm sorry I couldn't make it any bigger, but this is basically a chart that kind of shows the different kings within each kingdom. So at the very top, you see the kings of the United Kingdom. So we talked about Saul. He's right up there. And then if you go over, it says God's judgment. He did evil. Then you got Ishbosheth. Can't say his name. It's kind of unknown how God saw him. David, he did right. Solomon did right in youth, evil in old age. And so if you start looking at this chart, all of the kings of Israel did wrong. All of them. Not one of them did anything good. And again, the classic line from the books of Kings and Chronicles is the kings of Israel consistently did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They didn't have that heart change again. They consistently just fell into idolatry. Now, the kings of Judah, they're a little bit better, a little bit more mixed. 6 of the 20 were considered good. Asa, Jehoshaphat, Uzziah, Jotham. Let's go to the next one. Uzziah, Jotham, Hezekiah, and Josiah. So again, you can see at the bottom here on the right that all the kings of Israel did wrong. At the very bottom, what did it lead to? The Assyrian captivity. At the bottom of Judah, the Babylonian captivity. So again, you got the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's only a few good kings. They're mostly bad. And there are some very, very ugly kings that we can go through. All the ones that are bad and ugly, I mean, the idolatry that they committed was just so heinous that the Lord burned with anger against them. One good king in particular that we can highlight was Josiah. He was very young. He was very studious. He loved the word of the Lord. He was one of the ones that rediscovered the scriptures and put it right back into the center of the community. He restored a lot of the temple worship. And key to Josiah is he had a passion and a love for the Lord. It was a wholehearted concentration towards serving Yahweh, just being obedient to his word. And that reflected on his kingdom. They saw prosperity. They saw just kind of a regaining of their materials, of their status, of peace within their kingdom. And that's because he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. Now, the mostly bad, again, that we're talking about the majority of them here, one, for example, is Ahaz, who steadfastly determined to reject the Lord. So even it's not like he even started out good. He just steadfastly said, nope, not doing it. I'm going to go and do my own thing. He even went to the extent of sacrificing his own children. So again, just the abomination that these kings were doing is just brutal and had brutal effects for the kingdom. And then the ugly, you got two in particular. Three that I've highlighted was Jeroboam, who was the first king, which interestingly, of the 18 kings who succeeded him, 15 are reported to acted like him. That's how bad he was. They were just as bad as that first guy, Jeroboam. King Ahab, again, wholeheartedly committed himself to selfishness and to the oppressed, or to just being ruthless with the oppressed. And again, Ahab is a cool story. If you go through it, you start to see how gracious God was. He sent prophets to him to try and turn him back, to try and change his heart, and he just refused. He just would not have it. And so there's a cool story in there, just with one of the prophets. I can't remember if it's Elijah or Elisha. I'll leave that to the end with my dad to clarify, where the prophet goes up against the priests of Baal, and they kind of have this kind of duel between each other of who will the God listen to, and obviously the God of Yahweh wins and completely just embarrasses and destroys any sort of allegiance to the Baals in that story. And then Manasseh was what is regarded as the worst king that was ever with the people of God. He did child sacrifices. He was just brutish in how he wanted to walk away from the Lord and do his own things. And again, the idolatry that he walked in had dire consequences for what was going to happen in Judah. So as we move just again from the kings, this is just a helpful kind of tool that I have. There are three main metaphors for idolatry whenever you're looking at the prophetic sort of literature. One that you will commonly see is the adulterous wife. So these prophets would often talk about the ways in which Israel is acting in regards to idolatry is like that of an adulterous wife. Some key passages are Ezekiel 16, Jeremiah 2-3, and the book of Hosea. The political betrayal. Now that's an interesting one because again, similar to Saul, when people were making sort of allegiances or political pacts with other nations, those people probably thought that, you know what, we're just trying to protect our nation. We're just trying to keep it safe. We're just trying to increase trade and prosperity. But again, the underlying issue within that is that you're saying we don't trust God. We don't trust that God is going to provide for us. We don't trust that God is going to protect us and fight for us. So we're going to turn to these other nations that are involved in a lot of idolatry. They're involved in a lot of just detestable things. And so we're going to help them out. We're going to pay taxes to them. We're going to make up different trade routes and stuff. And that's going to get us through. It's not going to be us trusting in God or Yahweh. And then the other common metaphor is just religious sacrilege, just the defilement. And one interesting point is that sometimes one's religiosity can sometimes be an idolatry. You believe that the works that you're doing, the sacrifices that you're doing, are working your way to better favor with God. And again, we see that very clearly just in the New Testament and in the ministry of Jesus, that it's not so much your works that get you by, but it's just the grace and the faith that we put in Jesus Christ. At the end of, or towards the end of Ezekiel, again, he kind of highlights this perennial issue. It's not so much having little idols. It's not having shrines and rituals. It is of the heart. Is it a sickness of the heart? And so God says to Ezekiel, I will show the holiness of my great name again, which has been profaned among the nations, the name you have profaned among them. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the sovereign God, when I am proved holy through you before their eyes. And so he says this to the people of Israel, for I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all of your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. And so this is very convicting, just because, again, it just shows the abundance of grace that God has for his people. He is a God of faithfulness. He is a God of mercy. He is a God who will always remember the covenant that he has made with his people. And despite just the repeated failures, just the abominations that the people of Israel had consistently done, from 39 days out of Moses leaving them, making the golden calf, to the Baal of Peor, to Joshua telling them, please follow, to the judges, to the kings, consistently they're just falling into this pattern of idolatry. God says, I will cleanse you from all of your impurities and from all of your idols, and I'll put a new spirit into you. And then that's a message that is still relevant and important for us today. The message still remains the same there. And when I was preparing this, a part of me was almost offended by the grace that God offers us and other people. It's almost like staggering. It's like my self-righteousness and my limited human perspective says, like, no, they don't deserve grace. Are you kidding me? Look what they did. They completely brought abomination just to your name. They desecrated your holiness. Like, how do they deserve your grace? And then I remember, like, wait, but what about me? What about the grace that, I want and I ask God for the things that I struggle with? And so again, it's an interesting perspective that grace is somewhat offensive. It doesn't really make sense sometimes to the human mind, but it does to God, because that's just his character. He has grace for you because he is faithful to you. His faithfulness to you is eternal. And so that's just the interesting story that we're seeing here, is the repeated failures of Israel, the jealousy of God, which kind of matches that, but then his return and zeal for his people to bring them back, to call them out of iniquity. So now we move more into the New Testament. Temple Run, if anyone played that game, kudos to you. Jesus confronting idolatry. And what I really appreciate about looking at Jesus with idolatry is that he makes it very simple and very clear. You go through a lot of the Old Testament, you have these narratives, all these kings, the poetry, the prophecies. Jesus just comes out and says it, that you cannot serve two masters. That's really one of the essences of his teaching towards idolatry. In verse 22, he makes it again very clear. The eye is the lamp to the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, what does that mean? If you're envious, if you're seeing different things around you that you desire for your own, you're like, I want a little bit of that. I feel like I can take a little bit of that and bring it into my faith. Your whole body will be full of darkness. If it's not the light of Christ, then it is something that has the potential to corrupt you. You have to be careful with it. And then he says in verse 24, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So in that particular case, he's referring specifically to money. In that story, I believe the name behind money is Mammon, which I believe that has history of being this own sort of deity or God, or this own spirit, just the idolatry of money. So if we're, again, talking about our present day culture and time, Mammon and the idol of money is very prevalent. And then the classic story in John 2, where Jesus goes into the temple and flips the table. Again, a lot of, as it says just at the end in verse 17, the disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. It doesn't say envy for your house will consume Jesus. It says zeal, because there's a sense of belonging. This is his Father's house. This is where he came to, to preach and to minister and to bring the good news, to bring the fulfillment of the law. And then he walks in there, and what does he find? He finds people selling cattle, sheep, doves, and others exchanging table and money. And there's just, again, this defilement, this religious defilement. So those metaphors I was talking about of the adulterous wife, of the political sort of agreements, and the religious sacrilege, Jesus finds that all in the temple, and he's furious. Again, this jealousy just fires up within him, and that's what sends him in there, just to drive them out. So a lot of times that story is often misconstrued, again, similar to how jealousy is sometimes misconstrued. It's not, and my dad raises a good point with this, on Jesus not losing self-control. He never lost self-control, because one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control, and Jesus walked in the fullness of the Spirit. So he doesn't lose his control when he goes into the temple to drive out people and to turn the tables over. What he's doing is he's allowing his zeal for his father, for the temple, and for his people to come in and rid it from all the idolatry that is happening around him. So again, we're going to end somewhat here just with Paul. So you can see how we started with the exhortation at the beginning of Paul talking about idols, and now we're coming back to Paul again. So there's two main things that Paul does really, really well. And you see it mostly between Acts 14 and 19. And then the first thing that he does really well is discerning idolatry. So wherever Paul went, he was very good at discerning the idols that were around. And so one of the clearest cases is in Athens. And Paul was just distressed. And again, if anyone knows Greek mythology, or if you're into kind of the stories of like Hercules and that kind of stuff, that's kind of what he walked into. He walked in all these temples and statues of all these deities, and he's just blown away. It's just full of idols. He's like, what is going on here? A little point here at the very beginning in verse 17, it says that Paul went into the marketplace. Now that's very interesting that Paul goes into the marketplace, because in those times, that's where everything happened. Paul goes right into the middle of where everything is happening in that culture. If you want to know where the culture was being formed and built during that time, it was in the marketplace. That was where everyone kind of came together. And that's where Paul goes. So there's probably a little evangelistic cue there of like how we can go out and change culture. We go into the place where culture is being made and we affect it and change it. And so these Greeks are saying like, this guy, Paul, he seems to be advocating for a foreign god. So they just see Jesus and Yahweh as another god among others. And Paul in verse 22, he says, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. There's a bit of sarcasm here by Paul. He's being somewhat playful. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you were ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man, Jesus, he has made all nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times and histories and their boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. So again, that's Paul's kind of basic theology just for coming against idolatry and discerning it. He's like, it's only in God, only in Yahweh, that in him we move and have our being. He is the creator of all things. That doesn't mean we worship creation. That means we just keep our eyes fixed on worshiping the creator. So Paul is good at discerning idols. He's also very good at exposing idolatry. So again, just kind of looking at ways in which we can apply this teaching to our present day. We can become better at discerning idols, and then we become better at exposing idols. And so this little passage right here is very interesting. It's one of the only cases in Acts where there's not a sermon given by an apostle. It's actually just an occasion where Paul is in Ephesus and he has done a preaching. And so people are very upset. They're like, well, Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands and no gods at all. These people are offended. These people in Ephesus are really offended by that. There is a danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited. And the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. So the people of Ephesus are really offended that Paul has kind of come in here and turned the tables. They're like, he's preaching against our great Artemis. Now, interestingly, Artemis was like the god of business, the one who brought in prosperity, the one who brought in money, trade. And that was very important to the people in Ephesus. They did not want to lose that. They felt that they had to keep on sacrificing and worshiping Artemis to stay prosperous. And so Paul comes in here and completely flips that on his head. He's like, this God here is made by human hands and is not a God at all. There's actually only one God, and that's Jesus Christ. And so he did this huge sort of shift happens in Ephesus, and a riot breaks out. So much so that in verse 28, when they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" And so they feel like if they just shout a little bit louder, or kind of all get together and say, "Yeah, Artemis is great," that will save them and stop Paul from doing what he's going to do. So again, Paul just has this knack for going into places, discerning the idols, and then coming around and exposing them like, no, these are no gods at all. There's only one true God, and that's Jesus Christ. And then I think this is just a good place to kind of wrap it up here. I know it's kind of been just a whirlwind from Exodus up until Colossians, but Paul really does set our eyes on one image. He says, do not worship all these smaller images. Do not create an image for yourself through the world or the culture around you, but only keep your eyes on the image of the invisible, which is Jesus Christ. He makes that firm throughout all of his writings. He has a very harsh line in 1 Corinthians about blending this one image, which is Christ, with other images. He says, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or are we provoking the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? And again, Romans 1 is just an amazing opening passage to that book, that kind of where Paul basically kind of lists just this constant striving towards idolatry that the human heart has. And so he says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness for those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Now again, Paul, he knows that all throughout history, God has revealed himself. We don't have an excuse. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. Now again, creation just points to the creator. It doesn't mean that we worship creation. So they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, that's a point towards our culture again now. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Now again, that last bit of verse 23, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being. That's completely in contrast to Christ, who is the image of the invisible God. And then this is just our final exhortation. It's from from Colossians 3. And I would like to read all of this to you, just as a way of finishing just this talk on idolatry. It is almost kind of a code of conduct for living in Christ and moving away from idols. And it's a very powerful meditation that we can each turn to see the ways in which Paul was just encouraging this Christian community to keep their eyes focused on Jesus. Do not turn to the left, do not turn to the right, but just keep your eyes wholly on him. He is that true image, and he is one who is faithful to us, and we can put our trust into him. So this is what he says. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Now again, just quickly, he's not referring to these little statues. He's not referring to shrines or temples. He's saying issues of the heart: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desire, greed. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now you must also get rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices, and you have put on a new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Here there is no Jew or Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you are called to peace. And be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And so just with everything that we've talked about the struggles of Israel, the things that they were constantly competing with, you kind of see how Paul just lays it out here with the framework of Christ. He's like, in Christ, we have all that we need. It is through him that we see this perfect image of God. It is that which renews us and sustains us and keeps us. It is worthy of our faith and our trust because he has been faithful to us. And he lays down just this ethic for living out a Christian life that is removed from idolatry, that has a strong foundation. And again, I think just from the evangelistic sort of standpoint, Paul he knew how to do it. He knew how to go into the center of where a culture was forming idols, and he knew how to expose those idols, and then he knew how to discern them, and then he knew how to expose them.